Okay, guys, welcome back to Human Physiology Lectures. So you started discussing the neurophysiology with Dr. Mshawati. So just taking over from where he ended. So you discussed with him the somatosensory system, then you also discussed with him the spatial senses. So I'm coming in to take over. So with me, we are going to discuss mainly the motor system, and there are also other aspects of the neurophysiology that we're going to discuss. So for instance, we are also going to cover reflexes, which are also part of the motor system, and some components are also part of the somatosensory system. Then we are also going to look at cranial nerves and autonomic nervous system. Then if you're going to have time, we are also going to look at memory, emotions, which is the limbic system, and also sleep patterns. So there are certain brain waves that are being produced when you're sleeping. So you need to understand sleep or the physiology of sleep. So all this is part of neuroscience that we're going to discuss. So like I said, with Dr. Mshawati, you looked at the somatosensory system, where you discuss different types of receptors that would respond to different stimuli depending on the type of the receptor, the location of the receptor. So these receptors, they are communicating with the sensory nerve fibers, and these sensory nerve fibers, they are found within the peripheral nerves, and these peripheral nerves, they are projecting to the central nervous system. And you know to say that the cell bodies of these sensory nerve fibers, they are found within the dorsal root ganglia that is just adjacent to the vertebral column. So these ganglia, you have these sensory neurons, and these sensory neurons are called the first order neurons. The first order neurons are the ones communicating with the receptors. Some of them, they don't necessarily have a special type of receptor, so you can have free nerve endings that are also responding to different stimuli. So once information has been generated at the level of the receptor or the free nerve endings, they're going to generate a receptor potential that is going to stimulate an action potential within the sensory nerve fibers, the first order sensory nerve fibers that are projecting to the spinal cord. So upon penetration to the spinal cord, they are going to form a synapse with a second order neuron, depending on the type of nerve fiber then. So these second order neurons are the ones that will project to the thalami within the brain tissue itself. So you have those nuclei that are deep within the brain tissue. So you have the two thalami, which are the relay center for sensory information. So the second order neuron will project and form a synapse within the thalamus or the two thalami. So from the thalami, you have the third order neuron that is projecting to the cortex, where you're going to have centers responsible for processing of sensory information. So the somatosensory cortex means you have the postcentral gyrus. So the postcentral gyrus, you have certain locations where you have centers for processing of somatosensory information or sensory information, especially in the Brodmann's area number 3, 1, and 2. Then you also have other sensory association areas that are also involved. So that you discuss with Dr. Mshawati. So after processing of this sensory information, the brain has to generate another information, which is called motor information. And this motor information is the one now that will project to the effector cells to stimulate these effector cells to respond. So you have these action potentials that will start descending from the higher centers or from the brain, descending to the spinal cord, all the way to the effector cells. And then they are going to stimulate the effector cells to respond. It could be a muscle cell, it could be a glandular cell that is responding to a certain stimulus. So you're involving the higher centers. This is where you have the integratory centers for sensory information. Then they're going to communicate with the motor cells that will carry another information to the effector cells. So this is where I come in now. Then you also discuss the spatial senses, taste, vision, smell, and balance, hearing. So all these spatial senses you discuss with Dr. Mshawati. So I'm not going to touch there. But you need to understand that when you were discussing special senses, you are also incorporating the cranial nerves that are involved there in transportation or transmission of sensory information that are coming from the spatial receptors that are mainly located around the head. You're talking about the eyes, the taste buds, the olfactory in the nose. So these spatial cells, they have receptors that generate information via the cranial nerves. They need to be processed within the cortex. So the cortex is also separated into certain locations where you have neurons that are processing information that is coming from the eyes. For instance, we have neural cortex that can do that. Then you also have other nuclei deep within the brain tissue itself that can also be involved in reflexes. So these are called cranial reflexes that you discussed with Dr. Mshavati. So without wasting much of the time, let's just go straight into this introductory lecture with regard to motor system. So it's very difficult for me to separate the motor system from the somatosensory system because these two systems are somehow interlinked. So we can't totally separate them. But for the sake of delivering information to students, we separate them so that you're able to understand the somatosensory system and also the motor system. So this lecture is just an introductory lecture. So it will have structures that are involved in motor system. In some of the structures, you've already discussed them with Dr. Mshavati. But I'm going to upload this lecture video on Moodle. So I've already uploaded the PowerPoint, and I'm also going to upload this pre-recorded lecture video. Then after that, when we meet, we're going to have interactive class. Maybe we're going to use Zoom or any other platforms. So we're going to have an interactive session whereby you are able to ask questions where maybe you didn't understand in the lecture, or maybe there are questions that you want to ask with regard to the previous lectures that we've covered. So that's where we're going to discuss that. It will be more of a tutorial where you ask questions and then we discuss. I'll be there to spearhead the discussion. So let's proceed with the information with this introductory lecture to neurophysiology. Okay, so you know to say the major part is the brain with regard to neurophysiology, and this brain is protected by the cerebral spinal fluid around it. So the fluid around the brain cells, because you know to say the brain cells, these are neuronal cells that are delicate cells, soft cells that needs to be protected. So we have the cerebral spinal fluid around the neuronal cells or the brain itself that is going to provide support. So for instance, if you traumatize yourself, maybe you hit your head against something, there is that buoyant function of the cerebral spinal fluid that is going to work like a shock absorber so that the brain doesn't move so much in as much as you have this trauma that is taking place. So it's going to protect the brain. And on top of that, the cerebral spinal fluid is also going to provide media in which waste products can be deposited, you know, to say the neuronal cells or the brain cells, they are also undergoing metabolism. So there are waste products that are coming from those cells. They will be deposited into the cerebral spinal fluid and then to go back to the circulation. On top of that, within the cerebral spinal fluid, you also find nutrients that are provided for the neuronal cells to function. The cerebrum is divided into lobs, or the brain itself is divided into certain parts or locations. So there are 4 major lobes of the brain. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And somewhere in between the temporal lobe, the frontal lobe, and parietal lobe, if you remove the operculum of these lobes, you'll be able to appreciate the insular lobe at the center here. And this insular lobe, you know to say it's involved in consciousness. So consciousness of an individual is also linked to emotions, compassion, empathy, taste, perception, and is also involved in motor control. So this is the insular lobe. Okay, so in most cases, it's not included. So you only appreciate the four major lobes: the frontal lobe, parietal, occipital, and the temporal lobe. Then you can also appreciate here the cerebellum that is actively involved in motor function. Then you have the brainstem. The brainstem, you have midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata that will form the midbrain. So these are the structures that we'll be discussing later on. So like I said, the neuronal cells are delicate cells that needs to be protected. So you find that you have the cranium. Within the cranium, you have the structures that are protecting these neuronal cells. So the outermost layer, you have the skin or the scalp. So the skin or the scalp is just located on the head, but not on the face. So you not say the head is with the face and the other portion. So the other portion, that's where you find the scalp. But on the face, there's no scalp. So the skin of the scalp, to some extent, it's more like an abbreviation for certain layers. So you have about 5 major layers of the skin of the scalp. Starting with the S would stand for the skin, just the general skin. Then the C, this is the connective tissue layer. And then after the connective tissue layer, we have A, which is apneurotica gala. So you have the apneurotica gala or gala apneurotica. This is a layer A. Then L is for loose areolar connective tissue. So loose areolar connective tissue. Then the P is for pericranium. So pericranium, you're talking of a layer of tissue just before the cranium or the bone itself. So it's also referred to as periosteum. So the pericranium is also referred to as the periosteum. So you have the skin, the periosteum. After the periosteum, you have the bone itself. So the bone of the skull or the cranium. Then after the cranium, we have the dura mater. So the dura mater, this dura mater, dura means tough, mater means mother. So dura mater, this is a tough mother. In other way, it's a tough tissue. So this tough tissue is composed of periosteal part and the meningeal part. So periosteal part and meningeal part, they are separated by a space, a tiny space, which is called the subdural space. Then after the dura mater, there is what we call the arachnoid mater. The arachnoid mater is also separating the brain tissue from the dura mater. Then between the arachnoid mater and the brain tissue, we have the pia mater. Pia means soft, mater means mother. So pia mater, this is more like a soft mother or a soft tissue, because this is where you have the cortex now, the neuronal cells. So in between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, this is where you find the subarachnoid space. In the subarachnoid space, you have more of the cerebral spinal fluid, and then you can also have innervation blood vessels that are located within the subarachnoid space. Then you have the pia mater. Pia mater, you have the cerebral cortex. So this is just the layers that are protecting the brain cells. Okay, so most of this information you already know. So let me not just waste time here. So let's just proceed. Then after the pia mater, or associated with the pia mater, you have the sulcus and the gyrus. So the sulcus are more like depressions or grooves. The gyrus, these are elevations. So the sulcus is one, plural sulci, gyrus is one, plural is gyri. So these are located on the brain itself. So you can see that the cerebral hemispheres, they are separated into the sulcus and the gyrus. So you have the central sulcus here, which is called the sulcus of Rolanda or Rolando. So this sulcus of Rolando is the one that is going to separate the post-central gyrus from the precentral gyrus. So the precentral gyrus is mainly involved in motor information or the motor system, motor processing of information. So it's called Brodmann's area number 4. Then the postcentral gyrus, this is where you have the somatosensory system coming in. So it's mainly processing the sensory information. So Brodmann's area number 3, 1, and 2. And then you have also other association areas that you discussed with Dr. Mshalati. Okay, then deep within the brain tissue, we have ventricles. And these ventricles are the ones that are responsible for the production of filtration of cerebral spinal fluid, because this is where you find the choroid plexus. So we have the 2 lateral ventricles that are found within the 2 cerebral hemispheres. So you can see the 2 cerebral hemispheres. You can appreciate the lateral ventricles. So you have these 2 lateral ventricles. Then the 2 lateral ventricles, they are connected to the 3rd ventricle via the foramen of Monro. So you have this foramen of Monro that will connect the lateral ventricles to the 3rd ventricle. The 3rd ventricle is found within the mesencephalon or the midbrain. So you have the midbrain, the 3rd ventricle, and then you have the aqueduct. So this aqueduct is connecting the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle. So it's called aqueduct of Silvers. So this aqueduct of Silvers is a foramen that is connecting the 3rd ventricle to the 4th ventricle. And the 4th ventricle is found within the pons, the medulla, and some portion of the cerebellum. So this is where you find the 4th ventricle. The 4th ventricle is the one that is communicating with the subarachnoid spaces via these 2 foramina. So you have foramina of Lucia on the anterior aspect, then you have foramen of Magdala on the posterior aspect of the 4th ventricles. So they're the ones that are communicating with the subarachnoid space. So you find that once the cerebral spinal fluid has been produced within these ventricles, so in the lateral ventricles, 3rd ventricle, and 4th ventricle, you have choroid plexus that is responsible for the production of cerebral spinal fluid. So it will circulate in such a way that it will move via the 4th ventricle into the subarachnoid space via those foramen. So you have foramen of Lucia and foramen Magdala. So those are the ones that are communicating with subarachnoid space, so that this cerebral spinal fluid can now circulate around the brain tissue to protect it. Then again, associated with the 4th ventricle, you have the central canal. So in the central canal, you also find the cerebral spinal fluid that is now circulating at the center of the spinal cord. Okay, so this is just a summary of the ventricles. So you have the 2 lateral ventricles that are communicating with the 3rd ventricle via the foramina of Monro, or the interventricular foramina. So it's called interventricular foramina because it's between the ventricles, the lateral ventricles, and the 3rd ventricle. Then the 3rd ventricle also contains the choroid plexus, just like the lateral ventricles, they have the choroid plexus that are producing the cerebral spinal fluid. From the 3rd ventricle, the cerebral spinal fluid can move via the cerebral aqueduct or aqueduct of Silvers into the 4th ventricle. The 4th ventricle has got openings or foramina. So you have the foramina of Lusca. This foramina of Lusca is on the anterior aspect of the 4th ventricle, communicating with the subarachnoid space. Then the posterior or behind the 4th ventricle, you also have foramen of Magdala. So this foramen of Magdala is the one that is communicating the 4th ventricle with the subarachnoid space on the anterior or posterior aspect of the 4th ventricle. Then at the center here, you have the central canal that communicate with the spinal cord. So you can see the movement of cerebral spinal fluid from the lateral ventricles, 3rd ventricle, 4th ventricle via this foramen into the subarachnoid spaces. Then from the subarachnoid spaces, then they will be filtered by they will be filtered into the sagittal sinus. So you can see here we have the sagittal sinus, where you have the villi that are involved in draining the cerebrospinal fluid back to the venous system. Then it goes back to the circulation. So this is what I'm trying to explain. So you can see here that you have the movement of cerebrospinal fluid. It's being produced in the ventricles, the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the fourth ventricle. You have the choroid plexus that are producing cerebrospinal fluid. So once it's produced or it's filtered, it will move from the lateral to the third, from the third to the fourth. So from the lateral to the third via the foramina of Monroe, then from the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle via the aqueduct of Silvers that is found within the midbrain. Then from there, it will move into the fourth ventricle. In the fourth ventricle, you have these foramen that are on the anterior aspect of the fourth ventricle, which are called the foramen of Luster. Then you have on the posterior aspect, you have foramen of Magandi. So these are communicating with the subarachnoid spaces. So you can see the cerebrospinal fluid moving into the subarachnoid space to protect the brain because it's surrounding the brain tissue. Then after that, via the arachnoidal villi, the cerebrospinal fluid is able to move into the sagittal sinus, within the sagittal sinus, and then to be drained into the venous system. It goes back into circulation. But sometimes you can have blockage of these foramen. For instance, if you have blockage of aqueduct of Silvers, you'll find that there will be accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid within the lateral ventricles and the third ventricle. So there will be accumulation of fluid here so much that it will become big. So that will result into a condition which is called hydrocephalus due to the blockade of certain foramen. Then there is abnormal circulation of cerebrospinal fluid that results into accumulation of cerebrospinal fluid within these ventricles. Then that will result into a condition which is called hydrocephalus. So sometimes you can put some pipes to drain the excessive fluids back to the venous system as part of treatment of cerebral hydrocephalus, but we're not going into that. So let's proceed. Okay, so the brain with the 5 regions of the brain. So I'm not going to use this diagram. I think the next one is better. During development of the brain. So you know to say that in an embryo, at about 3 to 4 weeks of an embryo, you are only going to appreciate about 3 primary brain vesicles. So these 3 primary brain vesicles, the first one is called the proencephalon or the forebrain. Then the mid one is called the mesencephalon or the midbrain. Then the last one or the caudal one is called the rhombencephalon or the hindbrain. So at about 3 weeks, you only appreciate the 3 primary vesicles. Then later on during development of an embryo, at about 5 weeks, about 5 to 6 weeks, this is where you're going to appreciate the 5 secondary brain vesicles. So these 5 secondary brain vesicles, some of them is due to that the primary vesicles are dividing into 2 parts. So you can see here that the proencephalon will divide into the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The mesencephalon doesn't divide, it will still maintain the structure. Then the rhombencephalon will divide into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. So instead of having 3, you're going to have 5. So these will give you structures that are involved in motor function and sensory function. That's why I'm explaining this. So you know to say that the telencephalon is the one that will form the cerebrum. So you have 2 cerebral hemispheres. So the 2 cerebral hemispheres are derived from the telencephalon. Then the diencephalon, you have those nuclei at the center of the brain tissue. So you have the thalami, the 2 thalami or the thalamus, the hypothalamus and the epithalamus that will be derived from the diencephalon. Then the mesencephalon just forms the midbrain. Then after the midbrain, you have the rhombencephalon that will divide into the metencephalon and the myelencephalon. The metencephalon forms the pons and the cerebellum. So the pons and the cerebellum are derived from the metencephalon. Then the medulla oblongata is derived from the myelencephalon. So these are called 5 secondary brain vesicles. Inside them, you have a cavity. So these cavities are called ventricles. So in the cerebrum, you have the lateral ventricles. Then within the diencephalon, this is where you find the third ventricle. Then in the midbrain, this is where you find the aqueduct of the midbrain. Then within the rhombocephalon, where it divides into the mesencephalon, the myelencephalon, this is where you're going to find the fourth ventricle during development. So there are a lot of nuclei that are embedded within the brain tissue that are also involved in motor function and also sensory function. So you need to understand where these structures are coming from. So the central nervous system, the brain, there are 3 basic units of the brain. So we have the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain behind here. The forebrain, midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain, this is where you find certain nuclei embedded within the brain tissue, and also the 2 cerebral hemispheres. The midbrain is the mesencephalon, and the hindbrain is composed of the cerebellum behind here and the brainstem. The brainstem mainly is composed of the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. But when you're talking of the hindbrain, it doesn't involve the midbrain. The hindbrain is just composed of the cerebellum, the medulla oblongata, and the pons. So this is called the hindbrain. This is just a basic guide on the structure of the brain, which you'll have also covered in anatomy. So a bit of information on the forebrain, because when you're talking of motor function, you also need to understand the forebrain. So the forebrain is called the telencephalon. So the telencephalon, it includes all the cerebral cortex and the internal nuclei such as the basal ganglia, the hippocampus, and the olfactory bulb, and the amygdala. So these are the components of the telencephalon, or the forebrain, part 1. Forebrain, part 1, telencephalon. You have the cortex, or the cerebral cortex, the internal nuclei that are found embedded within the brain tissue, like the basal ganglia, which is mainly active again when it comes to motor function, the hippocampus, that is also active when it comes to memory, then the olfactory bulb that you discussed with Dr. Mshavati when you're looking at sense of smell, then the amygdala, which is also part of the limbic system. So it's also involved in emotion, the amygdala. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, this is where you have different layers of neuronal cells that are found within the cerebral cortex. You know, to say the brain tissue, the cerebral cortex, this is where you find the cell bodies of these neurons. But when you go to the spinal cord, it's the opposite. So the brain, the cell bodies are located on the outer part of the brain, which is called the cortex. So this is where you find the cell bodies. But as you go to the spinal cord, you find that the cell bodies of these neuronal cells are at the center of the spinal cord with the H-shaped at the center, the gray matter. Then on the peripheral, this is where you find the white matter. But that's not the case with the brain itself. So you have the cortex. This cortex will contain a lot of cell bodies of the neuronal cells. So it's composed of 2 to 4 millimeters of gray matter and up to 6 horizontal layers with unique neuronal projections and functions. So you have the 6 layers of the cortex. The first layer is called the molecular layer. Second layer, external granule cell layer, or external granular cell layer if you want. The third layer is called the external pyramidal cell layer. Then the fourth layer is called the internal granule cell layer, or the internal granular cell layer if you want. Then the fifth layer is called the internal pyramidal cell layer. So you realize to say that from the internal granular cell layer, this is where you have projection of those sensory neurons. But in the fifth layer, where you have the internal pyramidal cell layer, this is where you find the pyramidal cells that are involved in motor function. So their cell bodies are located within the internal pyramidal cell layer. That's why it's called the pyramidal layer. And those are called pyramidal tracts. So you have those pyramidal tracts whose cells are starting from this layer. Then you also have extra pyramidal tracts that we're going to discuss. Their cell bodies are not starting from here. They're starting from nuclei embedded within the brain tissue itself. Then you have the last layer, which is called the multiform layer. So the multiform layer, it also contains neurons that are involved in motor function. So these 6 layers of the cerebral cortex, they are further divided or subdivided into groups. So there are 3 groups. So there are those layers that are above the internal granular cell layer. So anything above is called the supragranular layer. In those layers that are under the internal granular cell layer, they are called infragranular cell layer. So the 4th layer of the cortex is the one that is used to group different types of these layers. Okay, so like I said, you have layers starting from 1 to 3. Layer 1, 2, 3, these are called supragranular layers. So in terms of function, the supragranular layers, they will contain intracortical connections. So intracortical connections. So the cortex or the brain, they are connected in as much as the visual cortex is separated maybe from gustatory cortex, but there is connection. Or maybe the visual cortex is also connected to the motor cortex. So that's why you're able, sometimes when you're seeing something, you're able to respond by moving the head or moving your body away from that thing that is coming towards you. Why? It's because within these layers, there are connections. So they are called intracortical connections. So one cortex can be connected to another cortex via these 3 layers, layer 1, 2, and 3. Then layer number 4 is called the intergranular layer that receives thalamocortical connections from the thalamus. So those, the somatosensory neurons, the 3rd order neurons from the thalamus, they will project to layer number 4, which is called the internal granular layer. This is where you find cells that will process information coming from the sensory receptors. Then after that, you have layer number 5 and 6. These are called infragranular layer because they are below the internal granular layer. So they are called infragranular layer. So they project to the subcortical regions. So you have projection of these neurons to the subcortical regions where you find those nuclei like the basal ganglia. They can project to the subthalamic nucleus. Okay, so to different nuclei that are found within the brain tissue. So you find that there's communication in terms of coordination of motor information. So that's why you find different layers. Okay, so the cerebral cortex, of course, is divided into lobes. By now, I've already discussed with you. So we have the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe is mainly involved in skeletal muscle movement. So this is where we're going to spend much of our time discussing the frontal lobe, because this is where you find Brodmann's area number 4, the primary motor cortex, if you want. So it will contain the primary motor cortex and motor association areas, or the premotor cortex that we're going to discuss later on. Then you have the central sulcus that is separating the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. In the parietal lobe, this is where you find the somatosensory cortex, Brodmann's area number 1, number 3, 1, and 2. Then you also find the occipital lobe behind here, or the caudal aspect of the brain. This is where you find the occipital lobe. The parietal lobe is mainly involved in primary somatic sensory cortex. Then it also have sensory association areas. That is the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe, it contains visual association areas and the visual cortex. Then you also have the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe, it will contain auditory cortex and auditory association areas, which is involved in hearing and balance to some extent. Then we have when you open the operculum, these operculum, they also contain the cortex that is involved in taste and smell. So you have the gustatory cortex within the operculum, and also the olfactory cortex that is involved in smell. And right here, you can appreciate the insular lobe or the insular cortex that I discussed with you earlier on. So these are just different parts of the brain. So the cerebral cortex is also divided into Brodmann's area. So this Brodmann's area is depending on the function of the portion of the brain or the cerebral cortex. So you have a lot of these Brodmann's area. So the Brodmann's area are divided. So we have, for instance, the area number 4, which is the primary motor cortex. So you can see the area number 4, area number 6 is the motor association cortex. So you have the primary motor cortex. Then area number 3, 1, and 2, these are called the primary somatosensory cortex that you discussed with Dr. Mshawati. Area number 17, this is the primary visual cortex. 18 is the association visual cortex. Then area number 41, 42, these are primary auditory cortex. So you have these Brodmann's areas that are divided depending on the physiological function of these parts of the brain. Then moving on to the telencephalon, the basal ganglia, these are the nuclei that are embedded within the telencephalon itself. So you have the basal ganglia, which are groups of nuclei. So we have the putamen, then we have the globus pallidus. The globus pallidus has got 2 parts. We have the lateral part of the globus pallidus and the medial part of globus pallidus. So the globus pallidus is the one shown in green here. Then we also have the caudate nucleus. So these nuclei, they are called the basal ganglia. Then on top of that, you have the thalamus. So we have 2 thalami. Then you can also appreciate the subthalamic nucleus and substantia nigra. So the subthalamic nucleus and the substantia nigra, sometimes you can have dysfunction of this part of the brain that will result into Parkinson's disease that we'll discuss later on how it comes in, Parkinson's disease. But if you combine the putamen and the globus pallidus and the lateral part of the globus pallidus and the medial part of globus pallidus with the putamen, this is called the lentiform nucleus. It will form more like a lens. That's why it's called the lentiform nucleus. So the combination of the putamen, then the globus pallidus is called the lentiform. So it will look like a nucleus. The major function of the basal ganglia is motor control. So connections with the motor cortex and the thalamus. So it has got connections with the motor cortex and also the thalamus. Main is involved in motor control, so that you have initiation of movement and also regulation of movement. So the major function is motor control. It's also involved in regulation or initiation and also termination of movements. So it's going to regulate initiation and termination of movements. Then some function in attention, memory, and planning. So it's also involved in attention, memory, and planning. So the combination of putamen and globus pallidus is called the lentiform nucleus, like I said. Then you have the amygdala and the hippocampus, which is also part of the telencephalon or derivatives of the telencephalon, amygdala and the hippocampus. So this is also called the limbic system. They are part of the limbic system. So you can see at the center of the telencephalon, you have the hippocampus and the amygdala that are also involved in motor function. So the amygdala and the hippocampus. What is the function of the amygdala? The amygdala is part of the limbic system, is associated with pleasure, fear, addiction, important in forming and storing memories of emotional events. So amygdala is involved in emotions. That's why when you're looking at the special senses, so smell, sense of smell is also linked to amygdala. So there are certain neurons, the olfactory nerve fibers that are projecting to the amygdala that will contribute the emotional part of sense of smell. That's why sometimes when you you are able to get a smell of a particular perfume. For instance, if your wife is using a particular perfume, you are able to link that smell to your emotions. Why? It's because there is a connection between sense of smell and the amygdala. In the amygdala, it will store emotional events. Then the hippocampus, in terms of function, it's also part of the limbic system. It's important in information of, it's important in the formation of memories, including spatial and navigation memory. So when you're talking of formation of memories, the hippocampus is involved. So when you have damage to the hippocampus, that can result into anterograde amnesia. So you find that the ability for you to retain new memories is compromised when you have a damage to the hippocampus, because the hippocampus is important in the formation of memories. So for instance, after watching this pre-recorded lecture video, then few minutes, I asked you a question on what you were watching. You can't remember anything. Sometimes maybe it's due to anterograde amnesia that is affecting the hippocampus function. So the function of the hippocampus, when it's compromised, sometimes you have difficulty in remembering things, especially new things. Then the forebrain, which is part 2, the diencephalon. So remember, the diencephalon and the telencephalon is coming from the proencephalon. So the diencephalon, it will include the thalamus, the hypothalamus. When you combine the telencephalon and the diencephalon, it will form the forebrain. So the forebrain is a combination of the telencephalon and the diencephalon. So the telencephalon will discuss just the major parts and major functions. Then what are the major parts of the diencephalon and the functions? So here, this is where you find the thalamus and the hypothalamus. So the thalamus, in terms of function, it's the main integrating center for sensory information. It receives inputs from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. So it's a relay center for sensory information. It also receives inputs that are coming from the basal ganglia and the cerebellum. That's why I'm saying you can't completely separate the motor system from the sensory system, because they are connected. So you can see in this diagram, you have the two thalami, then the hypothalamus. So these structures are derived from the diencephalon. The function of the hypothalamus is the main control center for autonomic nervous system, close association with the pituitary gland, important function in the endocrine system, the hormone release. So you remember with the endocrinology, we say that the hypothalamus contains some nuclei that are responsible for production of those releasing hormones and inhibitory hormones that can stimulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary lobe. And you also have hormones that are being produced from the hypothalamus, especially the preoptic nucleus and paraventricular nucleus, that are producing those neurohormones, the two neurohormones, the ADH and diuretic hormone and oxytocin, that are stored within the posterior pituitary gland. So the posterior pituitary gland will just contain ADH and antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So those two hormones. But just know that they are also involved in autonomic control, because you have those hormones that are involved in control of maybe pH, metabolism. We discussed that. So they also contain nuclei important in regulation of circadian clock, hunger, thirst, heart rate, temperature regulation. All this is located within the hypothalamus, which is part of the diencephalon. Moving on to the midbrain, we have the mesencephalon. So the midbrain doesn't divide, so it will maintain its structure, which will become the midbrain from the mesencephalon. So we have two major divisions of the mesencephalon. We have the tectum and the tegmentum. So we're looking at this portion of the brain. So we have the tectum of the midbrain and tegmentum of midbrain. Within the tectum, which is the posterior aspect of the midbrain. Then the tegmentum is the anterior aspect of the midbrain. So in the tectum, you have the superior caliculi. The superior caliculi will contain nuclei for visual reflexes. And then you also have the inferior caliculi that will contain nuclei for auditory reflexes. So visual reflexes, auditory reflexes is found within the tectum. Tectum, you have the superior caliculi and inferior caliculi. Superior is visual reflexes, inferior caliculi, auditory reflexes that you discussed with Dr. Mshalati, I'm sure. Then the anterior aspect, we have the tegmentum. The tegmentum, this is where you're going to discuss the substantia nigra, which you didn't discuss with Dr. Mshalati because it's entirely motor function. So the substantia nigra that produces, they contain neuronal cells that produce dopamine, and dopamine is involved in the regulation of motor function. So they release dopamine to the basal ganglia. And then we also have the red nucleus that is found within the tegmentum. So the red nucleus contains connection with the cerebellum for the coordination of movement. Then you also have certain tracts which are called extrapyramidal tracts that are starting from the red nucleus that we'll be discussing later on as well. The hind brain, you have the myelencephalon. The myelencephalon, you have two major divisions also. We have the medulla oblongata down here. This medulla oblongata contains ascending and descending sensory and motor tract connecting the cerebellum, the cerebrum to the spinal cord. So you have mainly ascending and descending. So you have motor and sensory nerves. So you have the sensory and motor tracts connecting the cerebrum to the spinal cord. So anything has to pass via the medulla oblongata. Talking of the sensory information and the motor information. So most spinal cord tracts cross over in the pyramids. This is why you have decussation of those spinal tracts. Decussation, whereby the right tracts will decussate to the left, then the left tracts will decussate to the right. So they'll form like a cross. That's why it's called a decussation. Deca means X. So decussation that is taking place within the medulla oblongata. They also contain nuclei that regulate breathing, blood pressure, and vomiting. Okay, then the other part, we have the pons and the cerebellum. So the pons contains pneumotaxic center, which fine-tunes the breathing rate. So when talking of control of breathing, you have the pneumotaxic center that is found within the pons. We discussed this when we're looking at respiratory physiology. Then it also relays information between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. The cerebellum is a feedback center for execution of motor movements and also controls posture and balance. When you're talking of posture and balance, that's the function of the cerebellum. So coordination of motor function with regard to posture and balance. Then we also have the lenticular formation, which is part of the metencephalon. So the lenticular formation contain nuclei that are located throughout the brainstem. So within the brainstem, we have these nuclei. For instance, nucleus of Tractus sagittarius is also part of it. So you have these nuclei that are located throughout the brainstem, which forms the lenticular formation. That can activate the cerebral cortex. That can activate your conscious for you to be awake. So it's going to regulate wakefulness and also muscle tone. When talking about muscle tone, it's also controlled by the lenticular formation. So like I said, the brainstem refers to the medulla oblongata, pons, and the midbrain. Okay, so with that information, let's look at levels of the central nervous system. So the major levels of the central nervous system. So there are three major levels. So like I said, three major levels of the central nervous system have specific functional characteristics. So these levels, the first one is the spinal cord level, then the lower brain or the subcortical level. This is where you find those nuclei that are involved in subconscious. Then we also have the higher brain or the cortical level. So these are the three levels of the central nervous system that are involved in sensory information and motor information. The spinal cord level, this is also where you find a lot of centers for reflexes. So it's involved in motor function as well. So the spinal cord level, in most cases, we often think that the spinal cord as being only a conduit for signals from the peripheral of the body to the brain, or in the opposite direction, from the brain back to the body. So we just normally think that it's just a conduit that is containing ascending fibers and descending fibers. Ascending fibers being the sensory fibers, the descending fibers being the motor fibers. But that's very far from the truth. So this is far from the truth, even after the spinal cord has been cut in the higher neck region. Many highly organized spinal cord functions still occur. For instance, neuronal circuits in the cord can still cause certain movement. So what this statement is saying is that the spinal cord is not just a conduit for transportation or for movement of those descending and descending pathways, sensory pathways. It also contains centers that are involved in regulation of certain movements. So for instance, when you're talking of walking movements, can be controlled at the level of the spinal cord. That's why even if you cut the head of the chicken, if you decapitate a chicken, you find that the chicken is still be able to run around. Why? It's because the centers that are controlling the walking movements, they are located within the spinal cord. So reflexes that withdraw portions of the body from painful objects, they are also located within the spinal cord. Reflexes that stiffen the legs to support the body against gravity is still located at the spinal cord. That's why when you decapitate the chicken, is still able to run around against gravitational force because you still have those centers intact. Reflexes that control local blood vessels, gastrointestinal movement, and also urinary excretion. So all these centers are within the spinal cord. So in fact, the upper levels of the nervous system often operate not by sending signals directly to the peripheral of the body, but by sending signals to control centers of the spinal cord, simply just commanding these centers to perform their functions. So it means that the higher centers, you're talking of the subcortical and the cortical level, they are mainly sending information to coordinate the centers that are located within the spinal cord. So even if you cut them off, you find that they are able to operate on their own. But for them to function in a much precise way and accurate way, it requires input that is coming from the higher centers. You're talking about the cortex and the subcortical level that is communicating with the spinal cord to command them to do their work properly. So the lower brain or the subcortical level, this is where you find those nuclei we are discussing. So many, if not most of what we call subconscious activities of the body are controlled in the lower areas of the brain. In the medulla oblongata, the pons, the mesencephalon, which is the midbrain, the hypothalamus, the thalamus, the cerebellum, and the basal ganglia. So we're going to discuss these structures later on, and then you appreciate why they're involved in motor function. For instance, the subconscious control of arterial pressure and respiration is achieved mainly in the medulla oblongata and also the pons. That's where you find centers that are involved in respiration, in the pons. Then the medulla oblongata, you also have centers for respiration. You also have centers that will regulate blood pressure. For instance, when you are looking at the cardiovascular system, maybe with Dr. Mshawati, he told you to say you have baroreceptors, chemoreceptors that are involved in regulation of blood pressure. And these baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, they are located in different portions of the arterial system, but mainly within the carotid sinus and the aortic arch, and also carotid body and aortic body. This is where you find the baroreceptors and the chemoreceptors. So the baroreceptors are responding to pressure, for instance. So if you have an increase in blood pressure, They are going to stimulate the opening of mechanosensitive channels with regard to the function of the baroreceptors. So the baroreceptors, they are sensing change in pressure. So when there's an increase in pressure, there are certain channels that are going to open up to allow influx of certain cations like sodium and calcium, and the influx will result into generation of the receptor potential that will depolarize the membrane to a threshold, and then more channels will open for sodium. You're talking of voided gated sodium channels that will open, and then they'll allow influx of sodium that will bring about the threshold potential. And this threshold potential will result into an action potential. The action potentials will be propagated via the cranial nerves. And these cranial nerves, when you're talking of baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, mainly the cranial nerve number 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve, and cranial nerve number 10, the vagus nerve. So they will send this information to the medulla oblongata. Within the medulla oblongata, you have nucleus of tractus solitarius. So when you have an increase in firing within these cranial nerves, cranial nerve number 5, cranial nerve number 9 and 10, the glossopharyngeal and the vagus nerve, you find that the nucleus of tractus solitarius will be stimulated. Then it will know to say that the blood pressure has increased. So it's going to stimulate the cardio-inhibitory center within the medulla oblongata. Then it's going to inhibit the cardio-acceleratory center. So you have two centers, the cardio-acceleratory center and cardio-inhibitory center. So the cardio-acceleratory center, these are the sympathetics. They will be inhibited. The cardio-inhibitory center will be now stimulated, and these are the parasympathetics. So you find that the parasympathetics now, via the same vagus nerve, will release acetylcholine that will have a negative inotropic, chronotropic, dromotropic effect on the heart muscles and myocardium. So you find that the contractility will reduce, the preload will reduce, the afterload somehow will increase. So because of that, you find that the cardiac output will reduce, and then the blood pressure will also reduce. So the subconscious control of arterial pressure is also taking place within this subcortical level, because this is where you find the medulla oblongata and those nuclei, the basal ganglia, the hypothalamus, and mesencephalon, like I've already explained. So even before you involve the actual higher centers, the cortex, the subcortex is also involved in motor control. So control of equilibrium is a combined function of an older portion of the cerebellum and also the reticular substance of the medulla, the pons, and the mesencephalon. So when you're talking of control of equilibrium, balance, and posture, the cerebellum is involved. In some of these nuclei, they are also involved. Feeding reflexes such as salivation, licking of the lips in response to taste of food are controlled by areas in the medulla, the pons, the mesencephalon, the magdala, and the hypothalamus. And many emotional patterns such as anger, excitement, sexual response, reaction to pain, reaction to pleasure can still occur after distraction of much of the cerebral cortex. So you find that even if the cerebral cortex is damaged, maybe due to trauma or whatever, or due to stroke, you'll find that these other things will still be there. Why? Because the subcortical level are also involved in control of these subconscious information that are controlled at the subcortical level. So by now, you know to say most of the things are taking place within the spinal cord and the subcortical level. So after the preceding account of many nervous system function that occur at the spinal cord and lower brain level. So one may ask a question to say, what is left for the cerebral cortex to do then? Because most of the things are being controlled at the level, the subcortical level and the spinal cord. So what is then the function of the cortex or the cortical level or the higher brain? So the answer to this question is complex. So the answer to this is really complex, but it begins with the fact that the cerebral cortex is an extremely large memory storehouse. The cortex never functions alone, but always in association with the lower centers of the nervous system. So in as much as the subcortical level and the spinal cord, they can control much of the things that are taking place within the body. They still need regulation. So their regulation is still coming from the cortex. So the cortex is the one that will store memory about how things should work. So you find that they work in collaboration. So without the cerebral cortex, the functions of the lower brain centers are often imprecise. So the vast storehouse of the cortical information usually converts these functions to determinative and precise operations. So if you want to have determinative and precise operation, you still need the input that is coming from the cerebral cortex, because the cerebral cortex is the one that will store memory. So it's a memory storehouse that is able to regulate the subcortical and also the spinal cord. So finally, the cerebral cortex is essential for most of our thought processes, but it cannot function by itself. So for it to function, it requires to work in collaboration with the other levels, the subcortical level and the spinal cord. So the cortex, the subcortical level and the spinal cord, they work in collaboration in control of motor function or sensory information. So with this information, I think we are done with the introductory part. By now, at least you appreciate the different components of the brain, the central nervous system that is involved in motor function and also sensory function. In this example, you can see this person who's playing chess. So it requires thinking and also coupled with the muscle movement. You're talking about the motor function. So you find that there's also stimulus when you're moving pieces, you're able to move a piece from one location to another location. Why? It's because you're also using sensory receptors to feel for these pieces for you to make movements. So you find that the sensory information, the motor information, and also certain reflexes, they work in collaboration, enable for a human being to operate normally. So you find that these interconnections between the sensory system and the motor system. So the next time we have a lecture, we'll also look at reflexes, and then from reflexes, we'll go direct into the actual motor system now, going deep in motor system, the components of these motor systems, now looking at the detailed information, neuron by neuron, nuclei by nuclei, center by center, and how they are involved. How do they relate? What neurotransmitters do they release? How do they respond? So all that information needs to be processed. And you know to say that the neurophysiology or neuroscience, this is a topic which is integrative. So you have to integrate everything. So remember, the major control systems, we said you have the central nervous system, the nervous system and the endocrine system. So these are the major control systems of the body. So we already discussed the endocrine system. So now we are just discussing the nervous system, neurophysiology. So thank you very much for your time. So you need to check this video, and then tomorrow we'll have the interactive section where you're going to ask questions. We're going to discuss before we go into the actual motor system. Thank you very much for your time. This is where I end this lecture.